They buried Richard Miller on a rainy Tuesday, but the real digging didn't start until the reading of the will. The room smelled of old money and expensive lilies. When the lawyer announced that Elena, the polished widow, would inherit the mansions and the millions, she didn't just smile. She exhaled, as if she had finally won a long, exhausting war. Her son Brad checked his watch, already spending the fortune in his head. And then came Jack, the son with the calloused hands and the grease permanently etched into his skin. When the lawyer handed Jack the deed to a rotting, bankrupt auto repair shop on the wrong side of town, the silence in the room was shattered by a single, cruel sound. Laughter. Elena laughed. She called it a fitting end for a failure. She thought it was Richard's final insult to the boy who never fit into their world. But she was wrong. She forgot that her husband was a man who built things from the inside out. She saw a rusting shed. Richard saw a vault. She saw trash. Richard saw camouflage. What she didn't know, what nobody knew until the storm broke that night, was that the old man hadn't disinherited his son. He had hidden the crown jewels in the one place he knew a woman like her would never look: under the dirt. And by the time she realized her mistake, the engine was already running. The funeral service smelled of expensive lilies and old money. It was a cloying, suffocating scent that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Jack stood near the back of the Oakwood Country Club's private hall, fighting the urge to loosen his tie. The suit he wore was off the rack, a polyester blend that felt stiff and scratchy against his neck, a stark contrast to the sea of Italian wool and custom-tailored silk surrounding him. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, hiding them. Even after scrubbing with industrial pumice soap for 20 minutes that morning, he couldn't quite get the ghost of motor oil out of the whorls of his fingerprints and cuticles. Here, among the pristine manicures and soft palms of the city's elite, his hands looked like evidence of a crime. At the front of the room, near the closed mahogany casket, sat Elena. His stepmother looked like a statue carved from ice and grief, though Jack knew only the ice was genuine. She wore a veil that didn't quite hide the sharp, calculating eyes scanning the room, tallying who had shown up and, more importantly, who hadn't. Beside her sat Brad, Jack's half-brother, slouching in a chair that probably cost more than Jack's truck. Brad was checking his phone, his thumbs scrolling idly, looking less like a son mourning a father and more like a passenger waiting for a delayed flight. Jack felt that familiar, heavy stone in his gut. He didn't belong here. He hadn't belonged in this family since he was 12, since the day his father married Elena and moved from the gritty edge of the industrial district to the manicured hills of the suburbs. Jack had stayed behind, in spirit and eventually in reality, clinging to the grease and the noise of the garage, the only place where his father had ever seemed real to him. The service ended with a series of hollow eulogies given by business partners who spoke of fiscal genius and market leadership, but said nothing about the man who used to hum barely audible tunes while tuning a carburetor. As the crowd shuffled toward the reception area for champagne and caviar, the family lawyer, a man named Sterling with a voice as dry as parchment, signaled for the immediate family to remain. The reading of the will was not held in a private office, but right there in a small, hushed anteroom off the main hall. It felt rushed, impersonal, like a transaction that needed to be closed before the appetizers got cold. Sterling adjusted his spectacles and began to read. The preamble was standard legalese, a drum roll of formality before the distribution of the spoils. Jack watched a fly buzz against the window pane, trying desperately to get out. He knew exactly how it felt. To my wife, Elena Miller, Sterling's voice droned. I leave the estate in the Hamptons, the primary residence in Hillsdale, and the entirety of my stock portfolio in Miller Industries. Elena didn't smile. She simply nodded, a slight inclination of her head, as if acknowledging a servant who had brought her tea correctly. It was expected. It was the lion's share. To my son, Bradley Miller, Sterling continued, I leave the liquid cash assets in the blindly managed trust, the vintage car collection housed in the East Wing garage, and the horses. Brad perked up, a smirk touching the corner of his mouth. The car collection alone was worth millions. He shot a glance at Jack, a look of pure distilled arrogance. And, finally, Sterling paused, clearing his throat. The silence stretched thin. To my eldest son, Jackson. Jack straightened his spine. He didn't expect money. He didn't expect shares. He just wanted something. A watch, a letter, acknowledgement that he had existed in the old man's life. I leave the property and assets located at 402 Industrial Way, known as Miller & Son Auto Repair. The silence that followed was absolute, but only for a second. Then, it was broken by a sound that cut deeper than any knife. A stifled snort. It came from Brad. He tried to cover it with a cough, but the amusement was leaking out of him. The garage? Elena asked, her voice smooth, feigning confusion, but unable to mask the delight dancing in her eyes. I thought we sold that dump years ago to pay off a lawsuit. Apparently not, Sterling said, closing the folder. It is the sole inheritance for Mr. Jackson Miller. Brad leaned back, shaking his head, his voice a stage whisper meant to be heard by everyone in the room. Congrats, Jack. You got the junkyard. Better make sure you're up to date on your tetanus shots before you go in there. Jack felt the heat rise up his neck, burning his ears. It wasn't the value of the property that hurt. He knew that shop was a rotting carcass in the middle of the Rust Belt, surrounded by boarded-up factories. What crushed the air out of his lungs was the symbolism of it. His father had built an empire. He had amassed millions. And in his final act, he had looked at his two sons and made a clear distinction. Brad got the gold. Jack got the rust. It was a final, legal declaration of what Jack had always suspected. To his father, he was just part of the machinery. Something dirty and utilitarian to be left behind in the dark while the rest of the family moved into the light. Is that all? Jack asked, his voice rasping slightly. That is all, Sterling confirmed, not meeting his eyes. Jack stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh, abrasive sound in the elegant room. He didn't look at Elena, whose face was a mask of triumphant pity. He didn't look at Brad, who was already texting someone the news. He walked out of the room, past the funeral guests holding their crystal flutes, and pushed through the heavy double doors into the parking lot. The air outside was humid and heavy, threatening rain. He loosened his tie, ripping the top button off in the process. He didn't care. He walked toward his battered pickup truck, the only dirty vehicle in a lot full of polished Mercedes and BMWs. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, his hands gripping the leather until his knuckles turned white. He didn't cry. Men like Jack didn't cry over lost fortunes. But as he turned the key and the engine sputtered to life, a hollow ache settled in his chest, heavy and cold. He had lost his father twice today, once to the grave and once to the truth. All right, Dad, he whispered to the empty cab, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and bitterness. You left me the mess, like always. He threw the truck into gear and drove away, leaving the scent of lilies and money far behind him. The drive from the funeral home to the industrial district was a 40-minute descent through the economic strata of the city. Jack watched the landscape change through his windshield like a time-lapse of decay. The manicured lawns and gated driveways of the north side gave way to strip malls, then to cramped row houses, and finally, to the skeletal remains of the old manufacturing zone. This was the Rust Belt's bleeding heart, a graveyard of brick and steel where the sky always seemed to hang a little lower, a little grayer. Jack turned onto 402 Industrial Way. The road was potholed, the asphalt cracked like dry skin. At the end of the cul-de-sac stood Miller & Son Auto Repair. The sign above the bay doors was a testament to neglect. The paint, once a vibrant red, had peeled away to reveal the dull tin underneath. The Miller was still legible, but the & Son had faded into a ghostly whisper, almost erased by years of sun and rain. Jack parked his truck next to a pile of discarded tires that had become a permanent part of the landscaping. He killed the engine. The silence here was different from the funeral home. It wasn't the polite, hushed silence of mourning. It was the heavy, dead silence of abandonment. He stepped out, his dress shoes crunching on gravel and broken glass. The humidity here carried a distinct scent, a cocktail of old motor oil, wet cardboard, and ozone. It was a smell that bypassed his brain and went straight to his gut, pulling at memories he had tried to bury for 15 years. This was the smell of his childhood, before the suits, before the mergers, before Elena. The main bay door was rolled up halfway, looking like a heavy eyelid unable to stay open. Jack ducked under it, stepping into the gloom. "I figured you'd show up eventually," a voice rasped from the shadows. "Or send a lawyer." Jack's eyes adjusted to the dim light. In the corner, hunched over a workbench cluttered with parts that looked like disemboweled metal organs, was Sam. Sam looked like he had been built out of the same spare parts as the shop. He was an older man, his skin permanently stained with grease, his knuckles swollen with arthritis. He wore blue coveralls that had been patched so many times it was hard to tell where the original fabric began. He didn't look up from the alternator he was scrubbing. "Hello, Sam," Jack said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "It's been a long time." Sam stopped scrubbing. He wiped his hands on a rag that was blacker than the oil, then turned. He walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg dragging slightly. A souvenir from a hydraulic lift accident in '98. He looked Jack up and down, taking in the cheap suit, the loosened tie, the fatigue etched into the younger man's face. "You look like hell, Jackie," Sam said. It wasn't an insult. It was just an observation. "Funeral was today," Jack replied, leaning against a rusted tool chest. "They read the will." Sam let out a grunt that might have been a laugh. "And let me guess. The queen got the castle, the prince got the gold, and you got—" He gestured around the shop with a greasy hand. "This cathedral of crap." "You knew?" "Your dad came by," Sam said, turning back to the workbench. "About a month before he passed? He sat right where you're standing, drank coffee from a styrofoam cup. He looked at this place like he was trying to memorize it." Jack felt a prickle of irritation. He had mansions, Sam. He had offices with views of the skyline. Why would he come here to stare at a leaking roof? Sam stopped working again. He picked up a wrench, weighing it in his hand. "Because this is the only place where he actually built something, Jack. Before the board meetings and the stock options. This is where he bled. You remember?" Jack looked around. The shadows seemed to lengthen. He did remember. He remembered being 10 years old, sitting on a stack of manuals, watching his father wrestle with a stubborn transmission. He remembered the way his father would smile, a real, genuine smile, when an engine finally turned over, coughing into life. That was before Elena, before the business grew so big it swallowed the man whole. "He left me a wreck, Sam," Jack said quietly. "The taxes on this land alone are probably more than the business brings in. It's not an inheritance. It's an eviction notice." Sam limped over to a small, grimy fridge in the corner. He pulled out 2 lukewarm beers and tossed one to Jack. Jack caught it instinctively. "Maybe," Sam said, cracking his tab. "Or maybe he knew that the other stuff, the money, the houses, that's just fluff. It disappears. You spend it, you lose it. But a machine?" Sam patted the fender of a disassembled Ford on the lift. "A machine doesn't lie to you. If it's broken, you fix it. If it runs, it runs. It's honest." Jack stared at the beer in his hand. "Honesty doesn't pay the bills." "No," Sam agreed, taking a long pull. "But it lets you sleep at night. Which is more than I can say for that stepmother of yours." A heavy silence settled between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic on the highway and the rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the back. Jack walked deeper into the shop, running his hand along the rows of tools hanging on the pegboard. Some were missing, outlined in marker like crime scene victims. Others were rusted solid. This place was a carcass, a dead thing. And yet, standing there with the smell of grease in his nose and the taste of cheap beer on his tongue, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in the polished halls of the country club. He felt ground beneath his feet. He wasn't floating in the abstract world of finance and high society anymore. He was standing in the wreckage of his origin story. "I got an offer," Jack said, his back to Sam. "A developer. Wants to bulldoze it for a parking lot." Sam didn't flinch. He just set his beer down with a sharp clink. "Easy money. Take the check, Jack. Wash your hands of the grease. Go buy a nicer suit." Jack turned. He looked at the old man, seeing the judgment in those tired eyes. Then he looked at the faded "and son" on the sign outside, visible through the dirty window. "I'm not selling," Jack said. The words came out before he had even fully formed the thought. Sam's eyebrows raised, just a fraction. "I'm going to sleep in the office tonight," Jack continued, his voice hardening. "Tomorrow we start inventory. If this ship is sinking, I want to know exactly what kind of holes we're dealing with." Sam stared at him for a long moment, searching for the boy he used to know inside the man standing before him. Slowly, a corner of his mouth twitched upward. "There's a cot in the back," Sam muttered, turning back to his alternator. "Smells like mildew and dead rats. You'll feel right at home." Jack watched him work for a moment, then took a sip of the warm beer. It tasted terrible. It tasted like reality. Outside, the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon of the factories, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor. The garage was ugly, broken, and worthless to the world. But as Jack looked at the darkening corners, he realized it was the only thing in his father's life that had been real. And now, for better or worse, it was his. The first week at the garage felt less like a fresh start and more like a sentence served in purgatory. The office cot was a torture device disguised as furniture, a sagging canvas frame that dug into Jack's ribs and smelled of 50 years of stale cigarette smoke. Mornings began not with sunlight, but with the harsh, metallic taste of instant coffee made with tap water that ran slightly brown. Jack spent his days buried in an avalanche of paper. The desk in the small glass-walled office was piled high with final notice envelopes, their red stamps screaming for attention. The property tax alone was a number that made Jack's stomach turn over. Then there were the utility bills, the supplier debts from 3 years ago, and a lien from the city regarding code violations. His father hadn't just left him a business. He had left him a sinking ship with no lifeboats. By Wednesday afternoon, the humidity had spiked, turning the garage into a sweatbox. Jack was arguing with a vendor on the rotary phone, a plastic relic that felt greasy against his ear, when a low, guttural growl cut through the ambient noise of the industrial park. It wasn't a truck. It was the high-pitched, precision-tuned scream of a European V12 engine. Jack hung up the phone. Through the grime-streaked window, he watched a sleek, silver McLaren pull into the gravel lot. It looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in a landfill. The gull-wing door hissed open, and Brad stepped out. He was wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than the total inventory of the shop's parts room, paired with white loafers that had never touched anything dirtier than a country club fairway. He took a moment to inspect the ground before stepping gingerly onto a patch of relatively clean concrete, his face twisted in a grimace of distaste. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and walked out to meet him. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He knew Brad wouldn't take it. "Lost?" Jack asked, his voice flat. Brad laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. "Just doing a wellness check. Mom was worried. She thought maybe the roof had finally caved in on you." "Roof's fine, Brad. What do you want?" Brad leaned against the fender of his car, crossing his arms. He looked out at the rows of rusted sedans and the pile of tires Sam kept meaning to haul away. "Look, Jack, let's cut the tough guy act. We know you're drowning. Sterling told us about the tax liens. You can't afford to keep the lights on here, let alone fix it up." "I'm managing," Jack lied. "You're starving," Brad corrected, his tone shifting to a mock sympathy that was infinitely worse than his insults. "Mom wants to make you an offer, a generous one, considering this place is basically a Superfund site." He pulled a crisp white envelope from his pocket and held it out. "She wants the land. We need overflow parking for the factory logistics. We'll bulldoze this heap, pave it over. You get a check, you pay off your little debts, and you walk away with enough to, I don't know, buy a condo in a nice part of town. Maybe get a degree." Jack looked at the envelope. It was clean, sharp-edged, and blindingly white against the oil-stained backdrop of the shop. It represented an escape hatch. It was the easy way out. "And if I don't sell?" Jack asked. Brad shrugged, examining his manicured fingernails. "Then the city takes it for back taxes in 6 months. You lose everything, and we buy it at auction for pennies. Your choice, big brother. Be smart for once. Don't let your pride cost you a meal ticket." Jack looked at Brad, really looked at him. He saw the soft chin, the arrogant set of his shoulders, the complete lack of understanding of what it meant to build something, or fix something, or hold on to something when it was hard. Brad viewed the world as a menu. He just had to point at what he wanted. "Tell Elena," Jack said, his voice dropping an octave, "that if she wants this land, she can come ask me herself. And tell her to wear work boots." Brad's smile vanished. "You're an idiot, Jack. Dad knew it. That's why he gave the real assets to the people who know how to use them. Get off my property." Brad stared at him for a beat, his jaw tightening. Then he sneered, shook his head, and got back into the car. The engine roared to life, a sound of pure excess, and he spun the tires on the gravel, spraying stones against the corrugated metal siding of the shop as he sped away. Jack stood there in the dust cloud, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't shaking from fear. He was shaking from a rage so cold it made his hands numb. He turned and stormed back into the office. He needed to do something. He couldn't punch Brad, so he attacked the room instead. He grabbed a stack of old manuals from the corner and slammed them onto the floor. He kicked a rusted filing cabinet, the metal booming like a gong. "Stupid," he muttered to himself, pacing the small room. "Stupid, stubborn fool." He grabbed the drawer of the filing cabinet and yanked it open, intending to purge the trash, to throw away the past that was suffocating him. He pulled out handfuls of receipts from the 90s, warranty cards for tools that didn't exist anymore, and water-damaged invoices. He reached for a thick, leather-bound binder at the very back of the bottom drawer. It was heavy, covered in a layer of dust so thick it felt like felt. Jack dumped it onto the desk. It wasn't a tax record. It was an old maintenance logbook, the kind mechanics use to track repairs. He flipped it open aggressively, looking for something to shred, something to burn. The first few pages were standard: oil changes, brake pads, transmission rebuilds from 2005. But as he flipped further, the handwriting changed. It became frantic. The standard repair notes stopped, replaced by sketches. Jack slowed down. They weren't doodles. They were schematics. Detailed, intricate drawings of a fuel injection system he didn't recognize. There were calculations scribbled in the margins, mathematical formulas for compression ratios and thermal efficiency that went far beyond the knowledge of a local mechanic. He turned another page. There was a drawing of a containment unit labeled Cell 4, high-pressure prototype. Jack frowned, the anger in his chest cooling into a sharp knot of confusion. He recognized his father's handwriting, the sharp, slanted loop of the L's, the heavy cross on the T's. But he didn't recognize the mind behind it. This wasn't the work of a man fixing Toyotas. This was engineering. A folded piece of graph paper fell out from between the pages. Jack unfolded it. It was a timeline. Dates, meetings, and names. One name was circled repeatedly in red ink: Elena. And next to it, a single word written in capital letters, underlined so hard the pen had torn through the paper: compromised. Jack sat down in the creaking office chair, the silence of the shop rushing back in to fill the space Brad had left behind. He looked at the drawing of the prototype, then out the window at the setting sun reflecting off the rusted heaps of metal. Brad had called this place a junkyard. But as Jack ran his thumb over the charcoal sketch of a combustion chamber that shouldn't theoretically exist, he realized Sam was right. His father hadn't hidden the money. He had hidden the work. Jack reached for the phone, but this time he didn't call a vendor. He dialed the extension for the workshop floor. "Sam," Jack said when the line clicked open. "Don't lock up yet. Bring your flashlight. I think I found out why they really want this land." The storm broke over the city an hour after sunset. A violent, brooding tempest that rolled in from the Great Lakes. It didn't just rain. It hammered the earth, turning the gravel lot of Miller & Son Auto Repair into a slurry of mud and oil. Thunder rattled the corrugated tin roof of the workshop, vibrating the teeth of anyone standing inside. Jack didn't care about the weather. He was possessed by the logbook. He stood in the center of the darkened garage, the only light coming from the sweeping beam of a heavy-duty flashlight and the occasional flash of lightning through the skylights. Sam was beside him, leaning on a crowbar, his face a roadmap of skepticism illuminated in the harsh white glow. "Cell 4, Sam shouted over the noise of the rain pummeling the metal siding. "There ain't no Cell 4, Jack. The shop has 3 bays, always has." "The logbook says Cell 4 is external," Jack replied, wiping water from his forehead. The roof was leaking in a dozen places, weeping dirty tears onto the concrete. Dad listed coordinates: north corner of the lot, behind the tire heap. Sam spat onto the floor. "That's just the storage container. Been there since '08. It's welded shut. Your old man said it was full of asbestos padding he didn't want to pay to haul away. Let's go see, Jack said, already moving toward the back door. They stepped out into the deluge. The wind hit them like a physical blow, soaking their clothes instantly. They trudged through the mud, past the skeletal remains of the donor cars, toward the far corner of the property. There, almost consumed by overgrown weeds and rusted truck axles, sat a 40-foot shipping container. It was a monolith of orange rust, looking like it had grown out of the mud itself. Jack wiped the rain from his eyes and shone the light on the doors. Sam was right. The locking mechanism had been welded fused with a heavy bead of steel. It wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep something in forever. Get the torch, Jack yelled over the wind. 20 minutes later, the smell of ozone and molten metal mixed with the scent of the storm. Sparks showered onto the wet ground, sizzling and dying as Jack cut through the heavy iron latch. His arms burned from the weight of the acetylene torch, but adrenaline kept his hands steady. He was cutting through 15 years of silence. With a final groan of yielding metal, the lock gave way. "Help me with this," Jack shouted. Together, they heaved at the heavy steel doors. The hinges screamed, a high, piercing shriek of metal on metal that cut through the thunder. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the doors swung open. Jack aimed the flashlight into the black void of the container. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on chrome. It wasn't asbestos. It wasn't trash. Sitting in the center of the container, raised slightly on wooden blocks to save its tires, was a car. But not just any car. It was low, wide, and aggressive. Even under the layer of dust, the lines were unmistakable to a mechanic's eye. It was a custom build, a seamless fusion of classic American muscle and European aerodynamics. It looked like a shark waiting in the deep. "Mother of God," Sam whispered, the crowbar slipping from his hand and landing in the mud with a wet thud. "That's the Phantom. I thought he scrapped it." Jack approached the vehicle slowly, almost reverently. He remembered this car. It was a ghost story in the racing world. A prototype his father had obsessed over in the late '90s before suddenly abandoning the project. Elena had hated this car. She called it the Money Pit. Jack reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he wiped a streak of dust from the fender. The paint beneath was a deep, midnight blue. "Why hide it?" Jack asked, his voice barely audible. "It's beautiful, sure. Worth a fortune to a collector. But why seal it in a tomb?" "Open the hood," Sam said, limping closer. "Let's see what heart she's got." Jack found the latch and lifted the heavy hood. He aimed the light into the engine bay. It was empty. No engine, no transmission. Just a gaping hole where the power should have been. "It's a shell," Jack said, the disappointment hitting him harder than the rain. "It's just a body. There's nothing here, Sam. It's hollow." He slammed his hand against the fender in frustration. "He played me again, even from the grave. It's another symbol, a beautiful car with no engine. Just like the legacy he left me. Worthless." Jack turned to leave, ready to walk away from the container, the shop, and the memory of his father. But Sam didn't move. The old man was staring at the floor of the container, his head cocked to the side. "Jack," Sam said sharply, "shine the light down here." "It's over, Sam. Let's go." "Shine the damn light, boy." Jack swung the beam down. Sam was pointing at the wooden floorboards of the container, directly beneath where the engine block would have sat. The wood there wasn't dusty. It was polished, and there were scuff marks, circular ones, like something had rotated. The suspension is jacked up too high, Sam muttered, kneeling down despite his bad leg. This car, it isn't parked. It's guarding something. Sam reached under the car's chassis. He fumbled for a moment, cursing softly, until his hand found a hidden release lever near the suspension mount. He pulled it. A heavy thunk echoed from beneath the floorboards. The section of the wooden floor beneath the empty engine bay popped up an inch. It was hydraulic. Jack felt the breath catch in his throat. He moved forward, helping Sam grip the edge of the false floor. They pulled it back. It wasn't wood all the way through. It was steel plated with timber. Below opened a square shaft, descending into darkness. A narrow metal ladder disappeared into the earth. Cool, dry air rushed up to meet them, smelling of paper and filtered ventilation, a stark contrast to the humid storm outside. A storm shelter, Jack realized. He built a bunker. No, Sam said, looking down into the abyss. Not a bunker, a think tank. Jack looked at Sam, then back at the hole. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, but down there it was perfectly still. Stay here, Jack said. He clipped the flashlight to his belt and swung his legs over the edge. He climbed down, 10 feet, 15 feet. His boots hit solid concrete. He unclipped the light and swept it around the room. It was a small, windowless concrete chamber, dry and climate-controlled. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and corkboards covered in blueprints. In the center of the room, sitting on a stainless steel pedestal like a holy relic, was an engine. It was compact, intricate, and unlike anything Jack had ever seen. It gleamed with milled aluminum and titanium components. Wires and fuel lines were routed with surgical precision. It wasn't just a machine, it was a masterpiece. On the desk next to it sat a thick stack of documents bound in leather. Jack walked over and opened the cover. The first page was a patent application, stamped and notarized, dated 10 years ago. But the name on the patent wasn't Miller Industries. It was Miller & Son Technologies. Jack's eyes scanned the abstract. High-efficiency hydrogen hybrid combustion cycle, zero emission, 300% efficiency increase. He slumped into the desk chair, the magnitude of the discovery crushing the air from his lungs. This wasn't just an engine. This was the future of the automotive industry. This was what every major manufacturer had been trying to build for 20 years. And his father had done it, here, underground, beneath a pile of junk. Jack turned the page. There was a handwritten note clipped to the technical specs. To Jackson, the world sees the rust. They see the dirt on your hands. Let them. While they fight over the paint job, you hold the engine. I couldn't give this to Elena. She would have sold it to the highest bidder to be shelved and forgotten. I couldn't give it to the board. They lack the vision. I gave it to the only mechanic I know who listens to what a machine needs, not what it costs. You don't just own a garage, son. You own the ignition key. Make it run. Dad Jack sat alone in the silence of the underground chamber. Above him, the storm continued to ravage the earth. But down here, everything was clear. The anger that had fueled him for days evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. He wasn't the boy left behind in the rust anymore. He was the man holding the aces. He looked up toward the square of light where Sam was waiting in the rain. "Sam!" Jack yelled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Sam, get the truck. We're not doing inventory tomorrow." "What are we doing?" Sam's voice drifted down. Jack ran his hand over the cold, smooth metal of the engine block. "We're going to war." The morning sun did not break through the clouds. It merely turned the gray sky a shade lighter, a bruised purple hanging over the industrial park. Inside the office of Miller and Son, the air was stale, but the energy had shifted. The panic was gone. In its place was a cold, quiet precision. Jack stood before the cracked mirror in the washroom, adjusting the knot of his tie. It was the same cheap polyester suit he had worn to the funeral, the fabric slightly shiny at the elbows. He hadn't washed the grease from under his fingernails completely. It was a calculated detail. He needed to look like a man who was drowning. He needed to look like exactly what Elena expected, a desperate mechanic with no options left. On the desk sat the patent documents, now safely locked inside a battered leather briefcase that had once belonged to his grandfather. Beside it lay a new contract, drafted not by a high-powered firm, but by Jack himself, Yastuakbu, night before, typed out on the office's ancient typewriter. "You sure about this?" Sam asked from the doorway. He was leaning on his good leg, holding a mug of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "Once you walk in there, there's no turning back. You're walking into the Shark Tank wearing a meat suit." Jack picked up the briefcase. It felt heavy, weighted with the future. "Sharks only bite when they smell blood, Sam. I'm going to give them exactly what they want to smell. Just make sure you read the fine print before you let them sign." Sam grunted. "I wrote the fine print," Jack replied, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "I'm counting on them not reading it." The headquarters of Miller Industries was a fortress of glass and steel that rose from the city center like a monument to modern capitalism. It was clean, sterile, and intimidating. Everything the garage was not. Jack walked through the lobby, ignoring the curious glances of the receptionists, who clearly thought he was a delivery man who had lost his way. The boardroom was on the top floor. When Jack entered, the atmosphere was already thick with condescension. Elena sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by Sterling, the family lawyer, and Brad, who was spinning a Mont Blanc pen between his fingers with bored precision. "Well," Elena said, not bothering to stand. She gestured vaguely to a chair at the far end of the table. "I must say, Jackson, I was surprised to get your call. I thought you had more stubborn pride than this." Jack sat down, placing the briefcase on the floor. He hunched his shoulders slightly, making himself look smaller, defeated. "Pride doesn't pay the electric bill, Elena. The city sent another notice yesterday. They're going to seize the property." Brad snorted, not looking up from his pen. "Told you." "I'm tired," Jack said, letting a tremor of exhaustion bleed into his voice. "I can't fight the city, and I can't fight you. You want the land for your parking lot? Fine, take it." Elena exchanged a look with Sterling, a look of vindicated triumph. She slid a thick document across the polished wood. "Smart boy. This is the transfer of deed. We're offering you 10% above market value for the land. It's charity, really, considering the cleanup costs we'll incur." Jack didn't reach for her contract. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. "I'll sign the deed," Jack said softly. "But I have one condition." The room went silent. Sterling peered over his spectacles. "Condition?" "I'm selling you the real estate," Jack said, his voice steady but low. "The dirt, the building, the scrap metal. But I want to keep the name. Miller and Son Auto Repair. It's the only thing Dad and I really shared. I want to keep the business entity active, just for sentimental reasons. Maybe I'll open a small shop somewhere else one day." Elena laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound that grated on Jack's nerves. "You want the LLC? That worthless shell?" It's just a name, Elena. It has no assets other than the tools I'm taking with me. Jack looked down at his hands. Let me keep the company name, and I'll sign over the land today. Elena looked at Sterling. The lawyer shrugged, flipping through his files. The entity, Miller & Son Auto Repair, has zero reported value, Mrs. Miller. It carries significant debt liabilities. If he wants to keep the corporate shell and the debts attached to it, he's doing us a favor. We just want the physical real estate. Elena turned back to Jack, her eyes gleaming with pity. You really are sentimental, aren't you? Just like your father. He held on to useless things too. Is that a yes? Jack asked. Fine. Elena waved her hand dismissively. Keep your little company. Brad, pass me the addendum. Sterling quickly typed up a clause on his laptop and printed it out. The seller, Jackson Miller, retains 100% ownership of the business entity, Miller & Son Auto Repair, and all intellectual property associated with said entity. The buyer, Miller Industries, acquires solely the physical real estate located at 402 Industrial Way. Jack read the words. They were simple. To Elena, they meant nothing. To Jack, they meant everything. The patent he had found in the bunker was registered not to Richard Miller personally, but to Miller & Son Auto Repair. By letting Jack keep the company, Elena was unknowingly handing him the engine. Jack took the pen Brad slid across the table. His hand hovered over the paper. Don't spend the check all in one place, big brother, Brad drawled. Although, I'm sure a new set of tires for your truck is expensive. Jack signed. The ink flowed dark and permanent. He wasn't just signing away a piece of land. He was closing the trap. Thank you, Jack said, sliding the papers back. He stood up, picking up his briefcase. He didn't shake hands. There was no need. Goodbye, Jackson, Elena said, already turning her attention to her phone. Don't take too long to vacate the premises. We have bulldozers scheduled for Monday. I'll be gone by tonight, Jack promised. He walked to the elevator, his heart hammering against his ribs like a piston firing in overdrive. He kept his head down until the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing him inside the private capsule. Only then did he exhale. He watched the numbers on the display count down. 30, 29, 28. They thought they had just bought a kingdom for pennies. They didn't realize they had just bought a graveyard, while Jack walked away with a resurrection. He stepped out into the lobby and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he had looked up the night before. The direct line to the legal department of Global Motors, Miller Industries' biggest competitor. Connect me to the acquisitions department, Jack said, his voice no longer tired, no longer weak. It was the voice of a man holding the royal flush. Tell them I have the Miller patent, and tell them I'm ready to talk. 2 weeks later, the conference room on the 45th floor of Miller Industries was celebrating. The mood was buoyant, fueled by the morning stock market opening. Elena stood at the head of the table, a laser pointer in hand, gesturing toward a rendering of a sleek, paved logistics center built over the grave of the old garage. The board of directors sat in rapt attention. These were men and women who spoke in percentages and dividends. And Elena was feeding them exactly what they wanted to hear. With the acquisition of the Industrial Way property, Elena announced, her voice projecting the smooth confidence of a seasoned executive, we finally secure the logistical corridor we've needed for a decade. Efficiency will increase by 12%. Overhead drops. The shareholders will be very pleased. Brad sat to her right, nodding like a bobblehead, looking smug in a suit that was sharper than his intellect. And the lingering issue? Asked Mr. Henderson, a gray-haired board member with eyes like a hawk. The stepson. Handled? Elena smiled, a thin, predatory expression. He took the settlement. The demolition crews broke ground on that eyesore of a garage this morning. It's over. The room murmured its approval. It was a clean sweep, a perfect corporate victory. Then, the double doors at the back of the room opened. They didn't just open. They swung wide with a deliberate, heavy weight. The murmur died instantly. Heads turned. Jack walked in. He wasn't wearing the cheap polyester suit anymore. He was wearing dark jeans, heavy work boots that thudded softly against the plush carpet, and a simple button-down shirt. He looked out of place, like a rough stone thrown into a jewelry box. But he walked with a terrifying calmness that made security hesitate at the door. "Jackson?" Elena sighed, her patience snapping. "This is a private board meeting. If you're here to beg for more money, you're embarrassing yourself. Security." "I'm not here for money," Jack said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the acoustic silence of the room. "And I'm not here as a family member." He walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the long table, directly facing Elena, and sat down. He placed a single file folder on the mahogany surface. "I'm here as the CEO of Miller & Son Technologies," Jack said. "And I'm here to discuss the patent infringement lawsuit I just filed against this company." Brad laughed, a nervous, barking sound. "Patent infringement. You own a pile of dirt we just bulldozed. You don't own anything." "I own the entity," Jack corrected, his eyes locking onto Elena's. "Read the addendum you signed, Elena. Seller retains 100% ownership of the business entity and all associated intellectual property." "You were so eager to get the land, you didn't ask what the company actually owned." Elena's smile faltered. A flicker of unease crossed her face, the first crack in the ice. The garage had no intellectual property. It was a repair shop. "It was a laboratory?" Jack said. He slid the folder down the table. It spun smoothly across the polished wood and came to a stop in front of Mr. Henderson. The board member opened it, adjusting his glasses. As he read, his face drained of color. This is the H-cell injection system," Henderson stammered, looking up at Elena with horror. "This is the core technology for our entire heavy-duty fleet next year." "Impossible," Elena snapped. "Richard developed that in-house. It belongs to Miller Industries." "No," Jack said softly. "Check the dates. Dad developed it off-site. He registered the patent under Miller & Son 10 years ago to keep it safe from a hostile takeover. He licensed it to the main company on a year-to-year basis. And guess what?" Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "The license expired the day he died, and as the new owner of Miller & Son, I'm not renewing it." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of air leaving a balloon. Elena stared at Jack, her mouth slightly open, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She hadn't just bought a piece of land. She had bought the wrapper and thrown away the chocolate. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have orders to fill. If we can't use that fuel system, the production line stops. The stock will tank." "I know," Jack said. "I spoke to Global Motors this morning. They're very interested in an exclusive license. They're talking about a buyout that would put Miller & Son, and me, in a very comfortable position." Brad stood up, his face red. "You traitor! Dad built this company." "Dad built the engine," Jack shot back, his voice finally rising, cracking like a whip. "You just spent the money. And now you're driving a car with no motor." Jack stood up. He looked around the table at the stunned faces of the board members. "You have two choices," Jack said, his tone returning to that deadly calm. Option 1. I sell the exclusive rights to your biggest competitor. Your stock collapses, your factory closes, and you explain to the shareholders why you lost the company's crown jewel because you were too arrogant to read a contract. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air like smoke. Option 2. You pay a licensing fee. To me. $50 million a year. For 10 years. And I want a seat on this board to ensure my father's legacy isn't stripped for parts. Elena sank into her chair. She looked small now. The Ice Queen had melted into a puddle of panicked indecision. She looked at Henderson, looking for an ally, but the board member was already glaring at her with open hostility. Pay him, Henderson said, his voice cold. Pay him whatever he wants, Elena, or I'll move for a vote of no confidence before lunch. Jack watched Elena. He saw the defeat in her eyes, the humiliating, crushing realization that the stepson she had treated like garbage now held the leash. I'll have the papers drawn up, Jack said. He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the room's gravity. The rust had overtaken the chrome. As he stepped out into the hallway, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Sam. Don't unpack the boxes, Sam, Jack said, a genuine smile finally breaking across his face. We're going to need a bigger office. 6 months later, the sign above the door was new, but it wasn't flashy. It was hand-painted, clean white letters on sturdy oak. Miller & Son, Automotive Innovation. The gravel lot was gone, paved over with smooth, fresh asphalt. But the old tire heap in the corner remained, now cleaned up and turned into a planter for wildflowers. It was Sam's idea. He said it reminded him of where they came from. Inside, the workshop hummed. It wasn't the chaotic noise of grinding metal anymore. It was the rhythmic, purposeful sound of a dozen engineers and mechanics working in tandem. The main bay now housed the prototype division for Global Motors, but the bay on the far left, bay number 1, was kept exactly as it had been. Jack stood in bay 1, wiping his hands on a rag. He wore a tailored shirt now, but the sleeves were rolled up, revealing the grease stains that never quite washed away. He wasn't in the boardroom downtown. He had hired a CEO for that. He was here, where the work happened. Outside, the autumn wind swirled leaves across the parking lot. A black sedan pulled up. Jack didn't look up as the door opened. He knew the footsteps. They were hesitant, softer than before. Hello, Jack. It was Brad. He looked different. The arrogance that used to fit him like a second skin was gone, replaced by a weary humility. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a simple jacket and jeans. Brad, Jack acknowledged, turning around. If you're looking for a job, HR is in the portable building out back, but you'll have to start sweeping floors. Brad managed a weak smile. I'm not here for a job. I'm leaving town, moving west, going to try to start something of my own, something small. Jack nodded slowly. Good luck. Brad lingered, his eyes drifting to the back of the shop, toward the spot where the bunker entrance was hidden. He really loved this place, didn't he? I always thought he came here to hide from us. But he came here to build for us. I never bothered to ask what he was building. He was building a safety net, Jack said quietly, for all of us. Even you, if you hadn't tried to cut the ropes. Brad looked down at his shoes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. He placed it on the workbench. It was an old pocket watch, the casing scratched and worn. I found this in Mom's jewelry box, Brad said. She hid it. It was his. I think it belongs in a garage, not a safe." Brad didn't wait for a thank you. He turned and walked out, the bell above the door chiming softly as he left. Jack picked up the watch. It was heavy, cool to the touch. He pressed the latch. The lid sprang open. Inside, the inscription was faded, but legible. To Richard. "Time is the only thing you can't fix. Use it well." "Hey, boss," Sam called out from the back, leaning on his cane. "We got the diagnostic on the H-cell running. She's purring like a kitten." Jack snapped the watch closed and slipped it into his pocket, right next to his heart. "I'm coming, Sam," Jack replied. He walked toward the back of the shop, past the high-tech equipment, past the engineers, into the noise and the life of the place. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore. He was fixing the past. And for the first time in his life, Jack Miller didn't feel like he was running a race he couldn't win. He felt like he had finally crossed the finish line. The engine was running, and it sounded like home. Sometimes, the people who laugh the loudest at the funeral are the ones crying by the time the will is read. Richard Miller knew the truth about his family. He knew that his wife loved the shine, but only his son respected the engine. He took a gamble, leaving Jack in the dark to prove who really had the grit to survive. I've got a question for you folks, and I'd love to read your thoughts on this. Do you think the father, Richard, was right to keep the secret from Jack until after he died? Or was it cruel to let his son suffer, even for a few weeks, just to teach a lesson? Tell me what you would have done in Richard's shoes down in the comments. I read through them, and you all always have the best wisdom to share. If you believe that hard work eventually pays off, and that the truth always finds a way to the surface, go ahead and click that subscribe button. It's a small click for you, but it means the world to us and helps us keep these stories alive. And don't go anywhere just yet. The video on your screen right now? It's about a grandmother who was left nothing but a dusty old sewing machine, until she found what was hidden inside the hem of an old quilt. Trust me, you're going to want to hear this one. Click right there and I'll see you in the next story.